During the second half of 1967, the administration had become alarmed by criticism, both inside and outside the government, and by reports of declining public support for its Vietnam policies. According to public opinion polls, the percentage of Americans who believed that the U.S. had made a mistake by sending troops to Vietnam had risen from 25% in 1965 to 45% by December 1967.
Summer and fall of '67 is the real tipping point. There is impatience in Congress, there is impatience in the public, there is great concern that while the enemy body count has increased, U.S. casualties have also increased. The economic cost has increased to the point where you have to have a tax hike, so that you begin to find in the summer and fall of '67 congressmen who had been supportive of the war beginning to question either whether we should continue to fight it or whether we should continue to fight it the same way. Some are saying get out, some are saying escalate. Their newspapers who had been supportive are beginning to raise serious questions. The real tipping point, I think, comes then.
The Johnson administration countered the growing anti-war sentiments with a public relations offensive in the states.
Because of the talk back in '67 of a stalemate, Johnson had mounted a major public relations offensive in the last part of '67, claiming that the United States was winning the war and citing all kinds of statistics and figures and otherwise to support this. And it had worked to the point that the numbers, the approval numbers for the war and for Johnson himself jumped up during November and December of 1967 and on into January '68.
Even General Westmoreland tries to alter public opinion. He releases a statement that as of the end of 1967, the communists were unable to mount a major offensive. We have reached an important point when the end begins to come into view. In a Time magazine article, Westmoreland defied the communists to launch an attack. I hope they try something, because we're looking for a fight. In early 1968, General Vo Nguyen Giap, the man in charge of North Vietnam's army, believed it was time for the North Vietnamese to give the American general what he wanted.
And there are arguments within North Vietnam, within the Hanoi government, as to they realize also that it's a stalemate and they're taking heavy losses. And so they decide in '67, late '67, to launch a major offensive in '68 to try to break the stalemate and put enough pressure on the United States to negotiate a settlement that will move them towards unification.
To break this stalemate, Giap drew up a plan for a major surprise attack on South Vietnam during the least likely day of the year. For several thousand years, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year has been a traditional celebration that brings the Vietnamese a sense of happiness, hope, and peace. In 1968, it became a time of bloodshed. It was during this holiday that the bloodiest military campaign of the Vietnam War was launched by the Communist North against the South. Signs of impending communist action did not go unnoticed among the Allied intelligence collection apparatus in Saigon. During the late summer and fall of 1967, both South Vietnamese and U.S. intelligence agencies collected clues that indicated a significant shift in communist strategic planning. By mid-December, mounting evidence convinced many in Washington and Saigon that something big was underway. During the last 3 months of the year, intelligence agencies had observed signs of a major communist military buildup. Communist stockpiles were built up in the safe areas of Laos and Cambodia. Caches in South Vietnam were filled and more were established. As many as 84,000 Viet Cong and NVA troops were in position to conduct the campaign scheduled to coincide with the Lunar New Year in 1968. On December 20th, Westmoreland cabled Washington that he expected the Communists to undertake an intensified countrywide effort, perhaps a maximum effort, over a relatively short period of time.
There had been quite a bit of information that was coming in about the buildup. So it was predicted by quite a few higher-up officers that there was going to be something major coming soon. They didn't actually think they would do anything on Tet because it was a major holiday for the South Vietnamese and North Vietnamese both. But they used that as a ruse, and because they'd furloughed a lot of the South Vietnamese soldiers during that time for like a 3-day pass to be home with their families for the celebration. So it really caught everybody off guard.
To deter any such possibility, he deployed 250,000 men, including half of MAC-V's U.S. maneuver battalions, to the I-Corps tactical zone.
You could sense what was coming before the attack, actually. We all went and manned our bunkers that night, even before the first round was fired.
Despite all the warning signs, however, the Allies were still surprised by the scale and scope of the offensive.
What's significant about this is that the Tet attacks come in a totally different area than they did before. Most of the fighting has been in the rural areas up to this time. The Tet fighting is in the cities and towns, from the 17th parallel all the way down to the bottom of the country. The idea being that if they can generate a popular uprising within the major urban areas of South Vietnam, they can tip over the South Vietnamese government, and the United States will have no choice but to leave. It's a major offensive, fought more by NLF than by NVA, but it's a huge offensive.
In the days immediately preceding the offensive, the preparedness of Allied forces was relatively relaxed. Hanoi had announced in October that it would observe a 7-day truce from January 27th to February 3rd for the Tet holiday, and the South Vietnamese military made plans to allow recreational leave for approximately half of its forces. No one, in either Washington or Vietnam, was expecting what happened. After coordinating with the Viet Cong and moving troops and supplies into position, the Communists made a diversionary attack against the American base at Khe Sanh on January 21, 1968. On January 30th, 1968, the real Tet Offensive began. Early in the morning, North Vietnamese troops and Viet Cong forces attacked both towns and cities in South Vietnam, breaking the ceasefire that had been called for the Vietnamese holiday of Tet.
During the Tet Offensive, they tried to overrun I-Corps headquarters, which was in Da Nang, which was staffed by Vietnamese Army personnel. And they held their own, and they killed about 25 sappers that were coming in. Sappers are the ones that have bombs tied to them and try to blow everything up. And they left them out on the helipad for 2 weeks and made the citizens of Da Nang walk by and look at them.
The size and ferocity of the attack surprised both the Americans and the South Vietnamese.
The night Tet started, we were in the down at the hooch and all that, and I think we heard mortar rounds and stuff like that, but it wasn't like we were getting mortared. It was in the background, and all of a sudden, like the Marine Headquarters Battalion First Sergeant came running through the two hooches, flipping on the lights, saying, "We're under attack. You know, get your weapons." And we're all going, "What's he talking about?" We all had hangovers. You know, we'd been asleep for about 2 hours, and we're still probably drunk. He got up. We said, "This is ridiculous." Turned off the lights, went back to sleep. You know, hour later, he's back in again. "This is serious. Get up there. You know, I'll have you all court-martialed," something like that. So we end up hoofing it up the road. They're getting all these headquarters guys, most of whom were clerks and stuff like that, have never been out in the field, organized into defensive situation. And we're doing, you know, we're rolling our eyes, like, oh, this is going to be bad.
With the dawn, the situation did not get any better.
Well, the next day was chaos. All the lifers are running around. There's major attacks all over Da Nang. All this stuff is going on. And I was able to find out that the 1st Recon Battalion, which was near us, got a recon insert going. And I got on a recon insert that afternoon and flew out to an area up in the mountains. And there was it was like a squad of recon guys. And we just sat out on a point out at the mountains south of Da Nang, watching NVA troops stream in toward Da Nang. And then there was a lot of movement. I mean, you'd never seen troops like this. I'd never seen, you know, large units like this moving through the area and stuff like that. And our planes would fly over in helicopters, and they'd all hide, you know, and you're talking like they were like a mile away or something like that. So, and we're calling in airstrikes and artillery strikes on them. So, basically for that part of Tet, first week or so, I kind of, you know, it wasn't a real bad situation up there. And the NVA were not up chasing recon guys. They had a plan, and they were going someplace.
During the Tet Offensive, coming back from, or when we got to Hoi An, all the Vietnamese that were there were trying to get on the helicopter to lift off because they didn't want to be there. They were frightened, and unfortunately we had to end up kicking their hands off the skids on the helicopter.
During all of these operations, the communists followed a similar pattern. They used mortar or rocket attacks, closely followed by massed ground assaults. These were conducted by battalion-strength elements of the Viet Cong, and sometimes supported by North Vietnamese regulars. These forces would join with local cadres, who served as guides to lead the regulars to the most senior South Vietnamese headquarters. The operations, however, were not well coordinated at the local level. By daylight, almost all communist forces had been driven from their objectives. The new MAC-V Chief of Intelligence notified Westmoreland that this is going to happen in the rest of the country tonight and tomorrow morning. All U.S. forces were placed on maximum alert, and similar orders were issued to all ARVN units.
I was in Hong Kong on R&R, rest and recuperation, January 31st, when the Tet Offensive actually began. And of course there was a major report in the media there, and it was clear to me that this was something enormous, that this was not like anything that had heretofore occurred in Vietnam. And I thought about it for 10 or 12 hours, and I had 3 more days to do in Hong Kong, and I realized that the Vietnamese Marine unit that I was with, there are only 12 advisors in the field for all of the Vietnamese Marine Corps, and they would be shorthanded, there would be casualties, and I needed to get back.
The Allies, however, still responded without any real sense of urgency. Orders canceling leaves either came too late or were disregarded. In Saigon, the communists succeeded in occupying the U.S. Embassy grounds for 8 hours before they were overtaken by U.S. soldiers. Although Saigon was the focal point of the offensive, the Communists did not seek a total takeover of the city. Rather, they had 6 primary targets to strike in the downtown area. These objectives were all assaulted by small elements of the local C-10 Sapper Battalion. The defense of the capital military zone was primarily a South Vietnamese responsibility. It was initially defended by 8 ARVN infantry battalions and the local police force. Joining that force was Marine advisor Ron Ray.
And we landed at Tan Son Nhut, and the Air Force was responsible for the security. They had the air police and later became air commandos in the Air Force. And a colonel ran up to me with a .38 in his hand, and he said, "Are you a Marine?" And I said, "Yes, sir, I am." And I saluted, and he said, "Would you be our company commander? We're under attack, or we're fearful of a next attack, and we're not really prepared for this kind of ground combat." And I said, "Sir, I'll see what I can do in the morning. I need to contact my unit," and I did that.
The fighting in Saigon produced one of the Vietnam War's most famous images. Photographer Eddie Adams' Pulitzer Prize-winning image of the summary execution of a Viet Cong prisoner on February 1st, 1968. General Westmoreland later wrote, "The photograph and film shocked the world, an isolated incident of cruelty in a broadly cruel war, but a psychological blow against the South Vietnamese nonetheless." The U.S. Embassy in Saigon, a massive 6-floor building situated within a 4-acre compound, had only been completed in September. At 02:45 on January 30th, it was attacked by a 19-man sapper team. The team had blown a hole in the 8-foot-high surrounding wall and charged through. Marine guards managed to kill the officers leading the attack before being killed. Their sacrifice caused confusion among the leaderless VC team. By 09:20, the embassy and its grounds were secured. By now, the Communist High Command realized that none of their military objectives were being met, and they halted any further attacks on fortified positions.
I think it's fair to conclude that the North Vietnamese didn't achieve their main objective, which was to generate an uprising in the South. The South Vietnamese did not rise up against the government. They tended to support it pretty effectively. They did not achieve that objective. On the other hand, the offensive had a huge impact in the United States.
Some sections of the city were left badly damaged by the combat and U.S. retaliatory air and artillery strikes in particular.
What the advisors do mostly is be a forward air controller ground. You're really responsible for making American military supporting arms available to the South Vietnamese and to coordinate those fires. Well, after a very slow going the first day, as these Vietnamese Marines, very courageous, very capable forces, were having a hard time in the house-to-house combat, and they needed to learn a few of the techniques. You fire at the door, you get somebody up close, he throws a grenade in by bouncing it off of the 4 sides of the wall and hoping that as soon as it goes off, the shock, you then go through the door and begin to clear. And we were clearing from the bottom up rather than the top down, which happened later. Once we could get a helicopter, we could land on a roof and attack from the top down, which is the best way to do it, using gravity on your side.
Ray knew that taking back the city room by room was going to be costly in men and time. He needed the help of real firepower.
I needed helicopter gunships, and they were all deployed. And that night, I got on the radio with a fella who was there with the first Cobra gunships that were brought for in-field testing. They really weren't deployed there yet, but this was the fastest. This was the hot rod for the 19-year-old Army warrant officer pilot who'd left his Ford and his Chevy in the United States and had been given, you know, a Huey. Now they were given the gunships, and I want to tell you something. This was the best thing that ever happened. We started putting them in. You could direct it, the cannon, the 40 millimeter cannon, the machine guns. So what we did was the field test was against the North Vietnamese regiment, dug in, and it proved its worth. Neither one was shot down. It broke the roadblock, and we were able to secure our objective in about 36 hours with rather minor casualties.
Faulty intelligence and poor local coordination hampered the communist attacks from the outset. By dawn, most of the attacks within the city center had been eliminated. The fighting ebbed and flowed for several days as the VC troops continued to attempt to rally there. Sporadic fighting continued in Saigon until March 8th.
In the beginning, when I got there in 1967, mostly we were engaged with the Viet Cong, and like I said, when they came over to the demilitarized zone, it was divisions of North Vietnamese that came across. Those were battle warriors. Those were guys they had a pretty good plan, and I think fortunately for our air power, that was a turning point of that particular situation. That we finally just said, hey. You can come across, but you're going to pay the price. And then they went back across after a while, I guess.
The United States and South Vietnam are able to regain much of what they lost during Tet militarily, but at huge cost. Huge cost in terms of Americans dead and South Vietnamese dead. And also at huge cost to long-term stability. Pacification programs that had seemed to work pretty well were set back as a result of Tet. What Tet does in the United States is to raise serious questions about whether the country is winning the war, and even more serious questions of whether it can win the war.